any organization that has a terrorist wing to it should be disfavored by the United States. Again, we have an inconsistent U.S. foreign policy where our adversaries and our geopolitical competitors believe that there are election outcomes that favor them. And that's why we have election interference. That's why Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran are happy with the results of the 2020 election. And they should be as fearful of a Democrat president as they are of a Republican one. And that should be an embarrassment to the foreign policy establishment of the Democrat Party.
Michael Pregent is Senior Fellow at Hudson Institute. He is a Senior Middle East Analyst and a former intelligence officer with over 28 years' experience in the region. Michael spent a considerable time in Iraq as an advisor to Iraq's security and intelligence apparatus. He served in Desert Shield and Desert Storm operations in the Gulf War. He was a liaison officer in Egypt and a company commander in Afghanistan. Since then, Michael has published numerous writings on ISIS, Iran's Quds Force, and on Syria and Iraq. Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Tal Heinrich, and this is Tal Talks Middle East. Michael Pregent, pleasure to have you on. Good to see you again.
You too, Tal. Thanks for having me.
Michael, I think we'll start with the recent developments in Iraq. Recently, there was another attack on Baghdad's Green Zone, where the U.S. Embassy is located. 3 rockets were fired, and it thankfully intercepted. But can you explain who is trying to send who and what message? What's going on there in Iraq?
Well, these are Iran's militias inside of Iraq. When I say Iran's, I mean the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' militias inside of Iraq. And what they're trying to do now is they're trying to test U.S. resolve ahead of the 1-year anniversary of our drone strike on Qasem Soleimani. Qasem Soleimani was killed on January 3rd, Baghdad time, 2020, and the 1-year anniversary is coming up. And the Iraqi militias are launching rockets towards the embassy to gauge what the U.S. response is going to be. And we continue to be disappointed by our partners in Baghdad, meaning the Prime Minister, the Iraqi security forces. These militia attacks cannot happen without the coordination from elements inside of the Iraqi security forces. And those elements that these militias are coordinating with, these militias tied to Tehran, are elements of the Badr Corps that wear the Iraqi military uniform and can make decisions like shutting down airspace to United States intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets that help the United States pinpoint where these attacks are coming from.
But that's a recurring event. So what's the procedure? What usually happens after such an attack? I mean, are there any repercussions?
Well, there's warnings. I mean, the deterrence was restored with the strike against Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, the leader of Kitab Hezbollah, last year. And since then, the militias were able to kill another American and another British soldier without repercussions, unfortunately. The United States should have done something last March when an American and a British soldier were killed in a rocket attack by these very same militias. Now they've been conducting these rocket attacks, and we continue to warn the Iraqi government and continue to make threats. We've even talked about shutting down our embassy in Baghdad because, you can't have an embassy in an international zone where the host government allows a militia tied to Tehran to rocket diplomatic missions with impunity. And so it needs to be more than verbal threats. It's time for the United States to threaten sanctioning and designating members of the Iraqi government, to include members of parliament that have direct ties to Tehran and direct ties to these militias conducting attacks.
There have been some reports recently that in case Iran would seek retaliation for the takedown of Qasem Soleimani, the U.S. might retaliate and intervene militarily, act against Iran. What do you think about these reports? I mean, is it likely to happen before President Trump leaves office?
I think if Iran does anything that results in U.S. casualties, and that may have been the mistake, to signal to Tehran that we would respond if there was a U.S. casualty. Mm-hmm. I think harassing the United States mission and attacking U.S. allies in Iraq should warrant a response from the United States government. There's a 55 target deck that is in place at the Pentagon and with the National Security Council. 55 targets that the United States will action inside of Iran. It doesn't mean all 55 will be actioned, but out of that 55, you can pick targets. And the Iranian people have already signaled to the United States that as long as the targets are military, as long as the targets belong to the regime and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that's okay. But we have to remember that Israel conducted 4 airstrikes inside of Iraq against these very same militias, and the Iraqi people didn't protest violation of their sovereignty by these Israeli airstrikes. In fact, they simply viewed it as an Israeli-U.S. coordinated strike against militias tied to the late Qasem Soleimani and to the current regime in Tehran.
Mm-hmm. We will talk about Iraq again in just a moment. We'll circle back, but I want to zoom out a bit and talk about you, Michael. You spent so many years in the Middle East, as we said in your introduction, and you saw firsthand how complex and historical some of the tensions there are. And, it's ethnicity, religion between different denominations of Islam, Sunnis, Shiites, you have tribalism, sects and whatnot. And then you come here to the United States and, people simply want to know, so who are the bad guys? Who are the good guys? Have you managed to come up with a scheme when you try to explain this to people, the complexity of the Middle East? Because that's by part what we're trying to do here.
Well, the biggest problem we have is, we've been in Iraq for 17 years and we've been in Afghanistan for 20 years. But let's go to Iraq. We've been in Iraq for 17 years now, and we haven't had a consistent foreign policy or a consistent strategy inside of Iraq. So you can argue that we've been to Iraq 17 times for 1 year, with each year either advisors changing out or in the worst case, the strategy completely doing a 180, completely changing. So when we go into Iraq in 2003, we basically are introduced to the English-speaking, suit-wearing, anti-Saddam Shia Iraqi. And we bring them in, not knowing that they're tied to Iran's premier militia, the Badr Corps, or the Supreme Council for the Islamic Resistance in Iraq. We naively succumb to the Iraqi who wears a suit and speaks English, and we view them as an ally, when in fact they've facilitated the complete takeover of Iraq by surrogates tied to Tehran right underneath our nose, and in most cases with our assistance. So when you look at the good guys and the bad guys, you have to look at who are the good guys today, who are the bad guys next week, who are the reconcilables next month, and who are the irreconcilables. And right now we're dealing with irreconcilables. So anyone who fights for the Sunni insurgency or fights with ISIS or Al-Qaeda remnants, those are irreconcilables. The militias are now becoming irreconcilables, meaning they need to be targeted. And there are leaders that command these militias that are very weak and very afraid of U.S. designations and sanctions. And they rely on this lack of institutional knowledge inside of the U.S. government and inside of the Defense Department to put a playbook in place. And that allows them to take advantage of the new American to the Iraq theater who doesn't understand that if you use a force that can fight ISIS, that doesn't mean it's a good force. We used the Hashd al-Shabi, the militias tied to Tehran, to go after Al-Qaeda and ISIS remnants, and we empowered them to the point where the biggest threat in Iraq is not from ISIS, it's from militias tied to Tehran, paid by the Iraqi government, trained by the United States. They have access to U.S. equipment, training, and intelligence. And that doesn't mean the United States is going out there and training Kataib Hezbollah. It just means that Kataib Hezbollah can put on an Iraqi army uniform and be trained on advanced U.S. systems. we have to remember that the only Iraqis receiving advanced U.S. training inside of Iraq have already been vetted by Iran's premier proxy, the Badr Corps, meaning it's it's an embarrassment. And one of the things in intelligence, when you don't get things right, it's often because you're unwilling to admit your failures and you're embarrassed by them, so you don't talk about them. And one of our biggest embarrassments in Iraq is we basically let people lie to us and ignored their lies when we found out they were lying, and allowed them to continue to take over this country. And that's what we have right now.
So sometimes they tell you the truth, you just don't want to hear it.
Exactly. Sometimes they tell you the truth by actions, and we believe their lies by voice. And that's one of the biggest problems we have. And we have basically promoted a government that 80% of its population is against, and we're the only things keeping it propped up. If we disfavored Baghdad, Iran couldn't keep it propped up. The Baghdad government continues because the United States continues to support the status quo that 80% of Iraqis are against.
So let's talk about our government for a second. A new U.S. administration means a new policy, maybe not really new in this case, but talk to me about the differences between the Trump administration and President-elect Joe Biden and what he intends to do. Let's start more specifically about Iran in the Iran nuclear deal. Where do you think things are going to go?
Well, I don't think there's an appetite in Washington, D.C. to simply jump back into the JCPOA. You can't just simply re-enter the JCPOA without Iran making major concessions on sunset clauses, ballistic missiles, and regional behavior. Three things that the regime says they're not going to negotiate on. And Biden's not Obama. This isn't Obama of 2015. The Obama machine could primary any Democrat and force their hand to support the JCPOA, the Iran deal. It only required 41 senators to support the Iran deal in 2015. The Iran deal could never become a treaty because it was so bad. And the good thing about 2021 is there's no appetite in DC for Biden to lift sanctions on Iran, to jump back into the Iran deal. If he did that in the second term under a Kamala Harris presidency, if that were to happen, Iran would be able to put a ballistic missile, be able to put a warhead on top of a ballistic missile and be in compliance with this fatally flawed JCPOA as it stands.
It's very interesting what you're saying, because on one hand, Joe Biden throughout his election campaign, and he's been saying throughout the past year that he intends to put the U.S. back in the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and there's a lot of pressure from fellow Democrats as well. I believe some on Capitol Hill wrote him a letter to do it right away. But I'm also hearing the approach that you're describing here, and I'm hearing it back in my home country, Israel, from Middle East analysts who say that Biden would not rush back to the Iran nuclear deal and actually present his own list of demands, which actually correspond with the Mike Pompeo famous list of demands. Also include that Iran would leave Syria, which is unlikely to happen. So hearing this coming from you, that you take that approach, is pretty reassuring. And I think, we're hearing similar tunes coming from Europe. Also Germany, the German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas recently said that a new agreement with Iran should be a nuclear plus agreement that also includes their ballistic missile program. And that's interesting. But from the Iranian perspective, not only that the West is not in a position to present demands, but the West has to compensate Iran for the maximum pressure campaign. I don't know if they really mean it. Is it just rhetoric, flexing their muscle, or what do you think?
It's going to be rejected because we're going to be out here every day telling the Biden administration that Tehran's making threats against them and trying to embarrass them again. If you're an incoming administration and the mullahs in Tehran are happy about you coming in because they think they can threaten you and take advantage of you, that should be embarrassing. And we have to remember who Biden's bringing in to be his foreign policy team. He's basically elevating the people that brought the failed Iran deal to a platform now where they have to take on more competent adversaries like Russia and China. And, Iran is going to be about the fifth or sixth issue in a Biden foreign policy. And the Biden administration is to be heavily focused. A Biden administration is going to be heavily focused on domestic policy. And you're not going to be able to just squeak in going back into the Iran deal or lifting sanctions. One of the things that Senator Ted Cruz mentioned is that that President Trump should submit both the Paris Accords and the JCPOA, the Iran deal, to the Senate, so the Senate can vote on them as a treaty. Because the only way this stuff survives is if it becomes a treaty. And there's no way the JCPOA would have garnered 60 votes in the Senate in 2015. And there's no way it's getting it under a Biden administration that is limping in despite what the 2020 election forecast. They're limping in. They have no credibility abroad. They have no credibility at home. This is going to be a government that's not going to be able to do much with a Republican Senate that loves being in the opposition, that loves saying no to policies. And so it's going to be a good time to be in the opposition here in the United States, to basically hold the administration's feet to the fire when it comes to China, when it comes to Russia, and certainly when it comes to Iran.
I'm wondering if Iran might want to talk. I mean, I can imagine if there was to be a second Trump presidency, then Iran, I assume, would have come eventually to the negotiating table. With coronavirus, the economic pressure, things are bad. Things are bad there. But the question is there a middle ground? Is there a common ground for Iran and the West now? And I'm saying the West, but in my head, I'm wondering, a scenario like in 2015 in which Middle Eastern countries were not involved at all as part of the JCPOA, I don't think that could happen again. I mean, things have changed, right?
Things have changed so much. If there was a second Trump administration, Iran would come to the table on its knees. Pompeo's list of 12 demands, it's beautiful because the regime cannot meet all 12 demands without collapsing. The regime could not meet 2 demands on that 12-point list without collapsing. If the human rights point that was added to the 12 points by Pompeo, if the regime simply said that his job was optional, the regime would collapse. That's how weak this regime is. And you can see it in the poetry and the writings in Iraq right now. In Iran right now. Similar to the fall of the Soviet Union, the first indicators of a fall were in music, art, and poetry. And we're seeing those things.
That's really interesting. Everyone who follows you knows that you have a soft spot for Iraq, having spent so much time there. How is this all affecting Iraq? To what extent is Iran really involved in the everyday life there? How is it affecting the small citizen?
Well, its government is beholden to Tehran. That's one of the biggest problems I have with narratives from my colleagues in other think tanks, is when they make this argument. Of course Iran has influence in Iraq. They border each other. Iran's a neighbor. And I counter with, Canada's a neighbor, and Canada does not decide our prime minister, or doesn't decide our president. And the Islamic Republic of Mexico doesn't control our security forces. In the case of Iraq, not only does Tehran decide who the prime minister is, who the president is, who the Council of Representatives speaker is, they also basically have hijacked Iraq's economy. They control Iraq's security forces, meaning they can tell it what not to do. And they have it stand down, and then they have the militias conduct attacks. Iraq is bordered by 7 countries, yet somehow the United States, through very bad foreign policy and very bad leadership, has allowed Iran an equal vote in Iraq, and Iraqis are rejecting that. 80% of Iraqis, and for the first time, the Shia youth in Iraq have now said no. Using chants like Iraq Hura, Iran Bara, meaning Iraq is free, Iran get out.
That is
And
huge.
those are
I just,
powerful.
I just want to, follow up on what you just said, because ever since President Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, we've seen these anti-Iran sentiments increasing in Lebanon and in Iraq. People daring to speak out against Hezbollah in Lebanon in front of cameras. That wasn't really the case in the past. People daring, to speak out, criticize Hassan Nasrallah, and in Iraq, speaking out against the militias. And even, if you remember last year when they set fire to the Iranian consulate in Baghdad. I mean, these developments are huge. I'm just wondering if we have yet to experience the peak of it. I mean, or is it just going to grow?
Well, the way these things work is they're peaceful one year, they're peaceful the next year, they're peaceful, and then they become armed revolution. Yeah. And we're looking at that now. Imagine if Anderson Cooper was in Baghdad when protesters were being shot in the face by militias and security forces tied to Baghdad's government. We would have had an Egypt situation where the people would have won the argument. The people would have won. We would have had a Tahrir Square moment in Baghdad, and it is Tahrir Square in Baghdad as well. The media, the Western media, they protect the actions of the regime of Tehran by not covering them. Obama was able to do something no president's ever been able to do. He was able to wrap his legacy in Democrats supporting the Islamic Republic of Iran, because to criticize the regime would mean to criticize Obama's rapprochement with Iran, to criticize Obama's JCPOA, his Iran deal. And the Iran deal literally began to die the moment it was implemented. The regime insulted the Obama administration on a daily basis with ballistic missile tests, with creating new militias, with providing lethal aid to the Houthis to start conflict on the Arab Peninsula. These all happened under the protections of the JCPOA, the Iran deal. And while people say the Iran deal was not meant to address regional behavior of ballistic missiles, it fueled destabilizing regional behavior. It fueled the ballistic missile program, meaning the $150 billion didn't go to the Iranian people. It went to spread the revolution. It went to the Vilayat al-Faqih. It went to the whole construct of destabilizing Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen for the benefit of a regime that 80% of its people in Iran don't support.
Indeed. And you don't see this reflected by U.S. media, Western media in general, this narrative of embarrassment to the Obama administration coming from Iran. That's definitely not what you see when you watch the Middle East coverage overseas. But people in the region do understand that. I want to ask you a bit about the sense of patriotism or nationalism in Iraq, because, you have Shiites that are against Iran, Shiites that are, pro-Iran, Sunnis, and so many other ethnicities and, different sects and tribes. So when you talk about nationalism in Iraq, fair to say that is something that Saddam Hussein tried to create but maintain, and of course he failed, just like Hafez al-Assad in Syria. Both have failed with what we're seeing today, more so. I don't want to sound too patronizing, but and I'll explain in a second. But do you think that besides the borders of Iraq, that, well, some of them were just, when you look at the map, it looks like it was drawn with a ruler, and it was actually by the British Empire. Is the nationalism sentiment there enough to meet, or in countries like Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, where you see all these tensions, is it sufficient enough to meet the threshold of what we call a nation? And I say I don't want to sound too patronizing, because I understand that in 2020, people can ask the same about the United States with the divisions that we're seeing at play here. But what's your thought?
Well, I think most Iraqis, 70% of the country is under the age of 30 in Iraq. And most of them have grown up with the U.S. occupation there. They are nationalists. Anytime there's an Iraqi soccer game or Iraq wins a soccer match, the nation feels it's their team. They identify the Iraqi as one of the proudest people in the Middle East. They don't want Saudi help. They don't want Syrian help. They don't want anyone's help. They certainly don't want Iran's help. But we could help them be stronger and push back against Iran if they could look at the United States as an ally that's going to be there no matter what. And with recent examples of betrayal on the KDP Kurds, the Barzani Kurds in Iraq, with the February 2017 referendum, or the referendum of 2017, and with the betrayal of Kurds in northern Syria, and then followed by the betrayal of the awakening, the Sunni Sons of Iraq by the United States. It's now the Shia youth that have this hope in the United States that we'll finally get this right. And that's the first time this has happened. The Sunnis are apprehensive. They're cautious because of U.S. betrayal. The Kurds are apprehensive or cautious because of U.S. betrayal. And the Shia now hope the United States will finally get it right. And all they're asking is stop supporting a Baghdad that is more beholden to Tehran than the United States. So I think there's a great opportunity to promote an Iraqi nationalism that is that wants more Americans inside of the country, more American investment. What I mean by more Americans is more entrepreneurs, more professors, more Americans in the arts, Americans that are willing to travel to Iraq without wearing suits or without wearing, flak vests, without wearing armored vests. Just basically Americans that are interested in basically plugging into this entrepreneurial, smart, tech Iraqi that it wants to go to Western universities, that wants the Iraqi passport to mean something respectable. And as long as it's tied to Tehran, as long as this government's tied to Tehran, as long as these militias scare away U.S. entrepreneurs, U.S. businesses, U.S. tech companies, Iraq will be a country that's not trusted by the international community. Even though its people want to be embraced by it, its government continues to put obstacles in its way by saying, well, we want to do this, but it's very difficult, we need more money, and then making the excuses that we can't do things without Tehran's permission. And that should embarrass Iraqis, and it's time for Iraqis to send a message to Baghdad and to send a message to Tehran.
I hear what you're saying, and I love your vision, and I hope, one day that will be the case. But you're talking about, the U.S. betrayal of different parts of the population in Iraq. And let me push back a little, because you're talking about the 2017 betrayal of the Kurds, for example, with the referendum. I don't want to get too much into it, but what I'm seeing is the other layer, the betrayal between the Talabani and the Barzani family.
Oh, yeah.
So I what I'm seeing is a different resolution. Before we talk about, a U.S. betrayal, there are different kinds of betrayals within the population. So that's why I asked you about the nationalism. But I think it's a very deep discussion to have. I want to ask you about the takedown of Qasem Soleimani, because it happened in Iraq at the Baghdad airport just a few months after the assassination of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS. Qasem Soleimani, of course, the top Iranian general. Were you surprised that President Trump actually chose to go with this plan among other options that were probably on the table in front of him? To what extent it really dealt a blow to Iran?
It was an incredible deterrence moment for the United States. This was Reagan's Operation Praying Mantis of 1988, when the Reagan administration sunk half of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' Navy and hit oil platforms, and then the regime backed off. Qasem Soleimani's death was the same type of moment. The regime needed to off-ramp, so they launched ballistic missiles on the non-American side of a base. Yes, we had concussions. Yes, we had U.S. casualties when it comes to being concussed, but no American died. It was meant as an off ramp for this regime to save face, and we didn't even need to give them that option. We could have shot down every one of those rockets shot down every one of those missiles. But the Trump administration gave them that option to off ramp, and then failed to continue the deterrence campaign by not targeting these militias when an American and a British soldier were killed in March of 2020. That was a big setback. You could see the writing on the wall that, Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, who is basically Iraq's Qasem Soleimani, and then Qasem Soleimani of the IRGC Quds Force, were basically walking around the battlefield taking selfies, and they were told they were not on the joint targeting list. They were told that the use of military force did not apply to them, and they were actually told that, maybe not directly, but through congressional testimony by people like Brett McGurk, listening to Mattis talk about Syria. They were basically told the use of military force does not apply to Shia militias, does not apply to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And I argued that if you have designated Qasem Soleimani and the Quds Force in its entirety as a foreign terrorist organization, DOD has equities. The Department of Defense can action those targets. And we saw that on January 3rd. And it was something that General Petraeus called a moment that restored U.S. deterrence. And I do believe we'll see some of these Iraqi militia leaders targeted before January 20th.
So I wanted to ask you, as a military person, and you come from the intelligence, and as a Middle East analyst, what's your general view on targeted assassinations? Because coming from Israel, and I'm very familiar with this debate, some would tell you that, of course, it's a great way to remove a security threat, to neutralize it, even if, and it's important even for the deterrence, even if just momentarily or for it lasts for a few years. But others will say that bad guys can always be replaced and will always be replaced by other bad guys.
Yeah, so I use this argument to counter that. I say, okay, so when Osama bin Laden was killed, is Zawahiri Osama bin Laden? Not even capable.
Yeah,
when Baghdadi was killed, can anybody name the new ISIS commander? I don't know what his name is. I mean, I would know, or I'd just look it up. And then Qasem Soleimani's replacement, Ismail Khani, doesn't even speak Arabic. This guy has no relationship with any of these militias that he's had. He had to call in Lebanese Hezbollah to act as a liaison with the Iraqi militias because Ismail Khani was unknown to them. So when you target somebody like a Zarqawi in Iraq, you get a replacement that has to be more violent in order to win over support. And when they become more violent, they make enemies. And when they make enemies, U.S. intelligence finds out about it, and U.S. intelligence is able to action those targets. So my argument is when you kill an effective terrorist leader, yes, somebody's going to replace him, but that person that replaces him is not going to be anywhere near as capable, as influential, as charismatic, and is not going to have the relationship needed to be able to hold everybody together. When Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes were killed in Iraq, the militias started doing their own things. They weren't being managed anymore, and Iran couldn't find a replacement. It wasn't Qais Khazali, it was Asaba al-Haq, another militia tied to Tehran. It certainly wasn't Muqtada al-Sadr, somebody that nobody considers a strong leader or a smart leader. And they're trying to make the new guy, the new commander of Kitab Hezbollah, his name is Abu Fadak, the new Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, and he's having trouble as well. So kill bad guys, kill effective leaders, and yes, somebody will take their place. It's just not going to be the same type of capable leader. And as they try to build that reputation, they become susceptible to U.S. intelligence collection and U.S. targeting.
Let's talk about peace after we talked about assassinating people and going to war. Peace is a good thing to talk about, Michael. So President Trump's deal of the century, the solution presented to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it did not end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but it did pave the way, some would say, to what we are witnessing now, maybe the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict, with Morocco, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Sudan signing their own peace agreements and normalization agreement in some cases with the Jewish state. There's no longer a united Arab approach on the Jewish state, against the Jewish state, I should say. How do you see things? How is this affecting Iran, by the way?
Well, I think it's again, it's consistent U.S. foreign policy, right? The Abraham Accords, basically, the Biden administration's against them. They might be for them under, quietly, but they're saying things that, John Kerry's been embarrassed by saying that there could be no peace with no Arab-Israeli peace deals unless the Palestinian issue is
The
resolved.
soundbite that you can watch forever. For every time he says no, he said 4 times no. There's a new peace agreement with an Arab in Israel.
It's beautiful. So it knocks down the argument that you can't have peace with Israel unless you address the Palestinian issue, and it also puts the Palestinian Authority under a spotlight. Are you against these peace deals because you like being flown all over the world and stay in 5-star hotels and you get treated like royalty because you're being oppressed by Israel? Do you like that status when the United States is willing to offer Palestine 10 million jobs for 10 million people who live there? And, it's what, a $10 billion economy? I don't know how many people live there, but I know it has a $10 billion economy. But, the Palestinian Authority likes the conflict. It needs the conflict to stay relevant. If there's peace, it goes away. It's an embarrassment for Iran. It's an embarrassment for administrations that said, you can't move the embassy to Jerusalem. It'll cause the Middle East to explode. That didn't happen. You can't make peace with Israel without addressing the Palestinian issue. It'll cause the Middle East to explode. That didn't happen. It's a new dawn in the Middle East because we're seeing Iran have such a polarizing effect that it's forging allies. Traditional Sunni U.S. allies are now making peace with our most reliable ally in the region, Israel.
Yeah, and it's not only Iran in terms of the enemy is my friend. I think it's also the Muslim Brotherhood here, because Iran is, it's an external, in some cases, in those specific countries that we're talking about, I think the UAE especially, it's an external threat, but the real threat, the more pressing one, is the Muslim Brotherhood, which is also a large topic we can briefly address. And by making peace or normalizing ties with Israel, it also sends a big signal to Muslim Brotherhood, to Turkey, that's expanding all over the Middle East right now. And when you were talking, you mentioned the fall of the Soviet Union before, and I think in terms of the Abraham Accords, my father always says that people who lived the moment of the fall of these stones, it was hard to comprehend when it actually happened, the fall of the Berlin Wall, what it actually means, that this would mean the end of Europe as people knew it. And maybe the Abraham Accords, Michael, is a watershed moment of this time.
Maybe it is the Berlin Wall. It starts with something falling over, and even though the Saudis haven't publicly said that they've made peace with Israel, there's already extraordinary things happening behind closed doors and in the skies over Saudi Arabia. There are good things happening in the Middle East. You mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood. You mentioned Turkey, a NATO ally that hasn't been acting like a NATO ally. The good thing is both Democrats and Republicans don't like what Turkey's doing, and it's going to put a lot of pressure on the Biden administration. We have to remember the loudest, most critical voices inside of the Democrat Party in the United States, the ones that were pro-Iran, pro-Qatar, pro-Erdogan, have been marginalized because of the losses that Democrats had in 2020 in the House. The Democrats in the House are more moderate now. They're going to be able to push back against people like, AOC and Ilhan Omar, and also against Nancy Pelosi. But Erdogan has made no friends with Democrats, especially with his security detail beating protesters inside of our nation's capital. And then the S-400 purchase, his overtures, his comments against Israel. And, Erdogan's not acting like a NATO ally. And then you have the whole Muslim Brotherhood issue. The Obama administration was had policies that actually favored the Muslim Brotherhood when we looked at Morsi in Egypt, when we looked at engagement of Erdogan, when we looked at engagement with Qatar. We need, any organization that has a terrorist wing to it should be disfavored by the United States. Again, we have an inconsistent U.S. foreign policy where our adversaries and our geopolitical competitors believe that there are election outcomes that favor them. And that's why we have election interference. That's why Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran are happy with the results of the 2020 election. And they should be as fearful of a Democrat president as they are of a Republican one. And that should be an embarrassment to the foreign policy establishment of the Democrat Party. Democrats are not known for foreign policy, going back to the Carter days, and they're starting to backslide big time, and starting to actually make Carter look good with some of these picks that Biden's making. I know that sounds political, but it's just factual. The people that brought you the Iran deal, the people that brought us a deal with a terrorist nation that further destabilized the Middle East, are now being elevated to a stage where they're taking on more capable adversaries like Russia and China.
Let's, before we let you go, Michael, and
Sure.
These are all very interesting points that you're making. I want to talk a bit about the U.S. military. And, one of President Trump's biggest campaign promises was to reduce the level of troops overseas. He did it in Germany, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and mainly also in Syria. But there are still many U.S. troops deployed in the Middle East. What's your view? I mean, when will be a right time? Will there ever be a right time to withdraw from places like Afghanistan, in Iraq, or Iraq?
Well, I argue that the reason we have forever wars is because the institutional knowledge is outside of government, in lobbying firms, in think tanks, and it's not the commanders that are saying we should stay in these forever wars. It's the experts that come in to tell the commanders this is why you should stay in these forever wars. And anytime an expert briefs Congress or DOD or a military general, they should disclose their business contacts in these countries. They should disclose that they're actually making money off of continued U.S. presence in these countries. We don't have a winning strategy in Afghanistan, and we don't have a winning strategy in Iraq. Both countries will continue to reintroduce American youth to conflict over the next decade to continue to fight the remnants of ISIS, remnants of Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban is getting ready to basically take back the country. And I would argue that in order to get it right, any military campaign needs to end in 2 years, while the president has the political capital to go all in heavy, and just do what you got to do. If you look at Desert Storm, that's exactly what Desert Storm was. It was a 1.5 year campaign. You go in, you have set objectives, you take Kuwait back, you hurt Saddam, you embarrass him, and you get out. We need to do things like that. These 17-year and 20-year campaigns, we just keep taking 1 step forward, 3 steps backwards, and it just doesn't work out for U.S. credibility, to be honest with you.
I mean, I hold the opinion that if you go to war, first you call it a war for a reason. You have very clear definitions of what the goals are, what it means to win the war. And if you don't have it, then, well, it's not a war. It's not actually, if you don't know what it means to win it, then just don't go to war.
Make it a war, not an experiment.
Exactly. So before we let you go, I'll just ask you this one question. I mean, having spent so much time in the Middle East and, zooming out of U.S. politics, then coming back and following things very, very closely, how do you think that it changed your perspective? I mean, are you able to see things that other Americans who have not served in war zones are not able to see?
I think so, and I think it's because I got out and I talked to regular people. Most of my peers in DC go to countries and only talk to the people in charge of the government. And I basically make the argument that if you came to the United States and you simply went to DC and talked to people inside of our government, how much would you really know about the United States? You wouldn't know anything about the United States, not a damn thing, excuse my language. And so when I have some of my colleagues say, well, I talked to the prime minister and he said this, or I talked to the head of the security forces, he said this, I said, yeah, you're being messaged. Go talk to regular Iraqis and see what they think, or regular Americans for that matter. I took my intelligence practice to the battleground states of this 2020 election. I went out and talked to people about the election, did things that I did in Iraq. The reason I'm a foreign policy expert in Iraq is because I was a domestic policy expert in Iraq. And so I applied some of that to my own country. Because as the United States goes into foreign countries and says you need to have free and fair elections, we need to have an example of that here. When the United States goes into a country and says that you need to, observe human rights, you need to, do the right thing, we shouldn't have two laws on the books, the Leahy Law and the Magnitsky Act, that the United States is afraid to use in Iraq, is afraid to use in countries that are actually using their security forces to kill protesters. And, there's a lot of parallels. So I am a foreign policy analyst, but, when you start seeing those same types of schisms in your own country, it's hard not to talk about.
Michael Pregent, that was fascinating. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, more so a pleasure to learn from you.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to have a captive audience.
There's so much more to say, so we'll have to do it again. But that is all for now. Thank you for watching Tal Talks Middle East. I'm Tal Heinrich. Don't forget to subscribe.
Thanks.